Hi, and welcome to this discussion of immigration and democracy, two issues that are deeply entwined, never more so than now. And this will be a conversation about how to understand immigration policy and politics at the current moment in our country's history. I am in conversation with a really, truly leading figure in the area, Doris Meissner, the former commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, a nonpartisan think tank that engages on immigration policy worldwide. Doris directs the U.S. policy arm of the Migration Policy Institute, and is someone who I, as a journalist, over the years have turned to time and again for her direction on policy questions, on questions of history and politics. And so it's my great pleasure and honor to be in conversation, Doris, with you this morning.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. This is a mutually felt view. You and I have had so many conversations over the years, and I will have to say that you know this portfolio and this subject as well, and probably better than any journalist that we work with. So this
Thank
is
you.
such a nice opportunity.
Thank you. Well, to follow in our usual rhythm of my calling you at kind of grave moments in our politics and asking you to contextualize it and walk me through it, I want to start immediately with where we are right now. You know, we're a month into the new Trump administration. Obviously, immigration is front and center, as it's always been for him politically, but it really seems now like there's serious momentum behind the administration's policy thinking on this issue. I'd love for you to start by giving us a sense of some of what strikes you in the historical context of being particularly noteworthy or extraordinary about what we've seen, even in this first month of the new administration.
So the way you characterize it, I think, is absolutely correct. And trying to understand it and talk about what's happening now, I think, does require digging back a little bit into how we got here. As you say, for President Trump, the immigration issue has been first and foremost since the very beginning. And by the very beginning, I mean when he announced in 2015 that he would be running for the presidency. And we will probably all recall that ride down the escalator at Trump Tower included right off references to Mexican immigrants and characterizing them as rapists and criminals of one kind or another. So that theme has been extremely motivating for his first presidency and then this reelection. But I think that the current situation is one where the immigration issue for Trump in his first term is an issue that he kept at the center of the discussion. But now at this second term and reelection, he has really seen it and has talked about the fact that he believes that it is the single issue that won him the election. In other words, and there is certainly evidence for that, because inflation and prices were the driving overall atmosphere in which he ran for office. But as he has said, you can only talk about prices so long.
Right. I remember him saying that. Yeah.
And it is the way in which he really picked up on the immigration issue during perhaps the last 3 to 4 weeks of the campaign. Constantly, it was an absolute drumbeat from every moment of the day for 3 or 4 weeks. And of course, it coincided with this very unfortunate situation in Springfield, Ohio, where the completely false issue of pets came up in the immigration context. And
that is to say, immigrants being accused absurdly of eating the pets of local residents in Springfield, Ohio.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And similarly, gang issues that had to do with a particular apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado. And he just really pounded on those issues despite absolutely no evidence whatsoever that those things were taking place. But it was part of his broader outlook on immigration, which does date way back, but which really became so important in the campaign. And that is the view that immigration is a threat to the United States. For President Trump, immigration is a threat to our national security, and it is a threat to the well-being of everyday Americans. That is a deep change from the way in which immigration has been viewed until recent years and until Trump came onto the scene. Now, it isn't just Trump himself. It tapped into things that had been going on over a number of years, but they were very much on the margins until he picked up on the issues in the way that he did. And so whereas we have had as a country a political consensus for decades that overall immigration is a net plus for the country, it is a comparative advantage for the country. And even though we may disagree on policies, and certainly there have been vigorous disagreements on policies between Republicans, Democrats, between in different parts of the country, et cetera. Nonetheless, overall, it's been viewed as a net plus. We now have a presidency that sees immigration as a threat. And the part of the Trump playbook also that we're truly seeing is his idea of promises made, promises kept. And so he is following through as he has said he would. This has been hiding in plain sight, as has been said all along. But the planning and the vigor and intensity under it that we're seeing now unfold has been surprising. And the shock and awe notion that he has brought into office, he has followed through on and is very much in effect. So where we find ourselves as a country is at a time of high immigration levels, absolutely, and very intense pressures for migration to the United States. But to that issue of immigration having become an election, having delivered a presidential election. And that has never happened before. This is new for us.
Well, and that's something that you've always stressed in our conversations, the degree to which in the past, in recent memory anyway, mainstream politicians from either party, speak about immigration because there's no way to avoid it. But very few until Trump have used it as the defining issue of their political identity. And obviously, his confidence in using this as the defining issue of his political identity has only grown in recent years. It occurs to me before we kind of launch into some of the specifics of what this shock and awe campaign has looked like in the first month of the second term. I want to ask you kind of greedily, because I'm very curious to hear your analysis of this, what you think some of the lessons learned were for Trump and his administration from the first term in office, because I think people generally assume that the first Trump term was chaotic and messy and undirected, because he wins by a shocking result. He's not expecting to actually be president. It's the personnel questions were all very helter-skelter for a while, but it did seem like the first Trump term achieved policy aims that he had outlined, at least in his first campaign. How should we understand kind of what lessons were learned from that first term and what the Trump team is bringing into the second term, the kind of baggage, the vision, the sense of what struggles, if any, they had that first time around?
So during the first Trump term, let's remember that the theme of the campaign and the theme of the first presidency was build a wall. Build a wall, build a wall, build a wall became a chant at all of the rallies. And of course, build the wall was to be not only done, not only addressed,
Yeah.
but Mexico was to pay for it.
Right.
All of that really has fallen away. Certainly, there was wall building that took place during the first Trump administration, but not nearly to the extent that he promised. And absolutely, Mexico did not
Right.
invest in that project. So we're hearing very little of that now in this presidency. It comes up, it's in Project 2025. It is certainly in the appropriation discussion that's now taking place in the Congress. But he has really backed away from that. It's, it's part of the picture, but it is not in any way central. And so I think that is one of the lessons that he just shifts to where there is opportunity and doesn't particularly feel a need to reflect back. He is described as a transactional person, president, and that is an example of it. But at the same time, some of the other things that he tried, such as a travel ban, stopping refugee admissions. In the case of a travel ban, we have not seen, and the travel ban failed in the first Trump administration, although finally it was restored. But I think they certainly learned that there was a process that they needed to go through for that there were regulatory changes that needed to be made. On refugee admissions, they cut and deeply reduced refugee admissions to, I think, only about 10 or 15,000 a year from what had been at least 50,000 and upwards to 100,000. They're doing that again because that really did succeed for them. They have given themselves 60 days now to do a review of countries around the world to determine where there might be the reasoning or the argument for a travel ban. So I expect that we might see something on that in the near future. And they have on the issues, perhaps, for instance, of temporary protected status, which is a policy that, even though it is rooted in statute, they don't like. And where that is concerned, they have given the proper notice, which the statute requires for ending the program. So
which, just to say, let me just clarify, just for those following who aren't kind of read into that drama, in the first term, Trump tried to cancel temporary protected status for, hundreds of thousands of people. And that cancellation got held up in court because the administration hadn't gone through the necessary administrative procedures before making a decision of such consequence. And so this time, with the aim of ending this special status that covers almost 1 million people in the country, they're kind of laying the framework now. They're starting the reviews. They're doing everything sort of by the book, so to say, so that they can withstand court challenges.
That's correct. There has been some very careful preparation, and some people that truly know these issues and know the immigration system, as well as having experienced it during the first Trump administration. You can see their handiwork. Now, that does not mean that there isn't also at the same time a great deal of chaos. There is a great deal of chaos. Certainly real uncertainties at the southwest border at this point about how to process and what rights people might or might not have. They have effectively shut down the border, but at the same time, there are some people that are being admitted into the country. From much of what we can tell, it's a very uncertain and very situational. So many of the policies that have to do with enforcement, especially with the southwest border, as well as with mass deportations, and we can talk about that in more detail, are still highly uncertain. And many of them are subject to legal challenge and are being challenged in the courts. So it's a both and.
Yeah. And I want to, part of my role in this conversation too is I want to kind of have us toggle between the politics and the policy, because they're obviously they're inescapably intertwined. And it seems to me that one bit of politics that's relevant to all of this is that the country seems to be in a different place politically on the kind of general immigration issue than it was during Trump's first term. Certainly Democrats who were, at the forefront of the resistance in the first Trump term are nowhere to be found for the most part in protesting or calling attention to some of the things that Trump is doing now on immigration. Tell us about that, because that's another major shift over the last few years that I think really colors our present moment. How did this attitude among Democrats and the broader electorate begin to shift toward more hostility toward immigrants? And what has that meant for Trump?
Yes, that's definitely the case. Public opinion is in a very different place. And I think the bottom line is, and then let me dig back a little bit into it, but the bottom line is that the public has lost confidence in the government's ability or in the reasons that immigration, as has been generally understood, makes sense for us as a country. So you can see this in the polling data, which up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago was steadily going upward in favor of immigration, more so among Democrats than among Republicans, but pretty much across the board. And favorability of immigration had reached somewhere in the 60 percentiles in the polling until a couple of years ago. It's now about 55% of Americans polled say that there should be decreases in immigration and that immigration levels need to be reduced. That's a very dramatic shift in a quite short period of time. And I think it comes about as a result of what happened in the last 3 or 4 years, which is these dramatic changes in the flows coming across the southwest border. Typically, our immigration up until 5 to 7 years ago was Mexican, young Mexican males trying to come to the United States and avoid apprehension at the southwest border for purposes of working in the country. And the ability to manage flows across the southwest border really was largely an issue of U.S.-Mexican relations. That began to change in the mid-2000 teens, and it has changed rapidly. At first, it involved Central Americans for 2-3 years, and that's going into the first Trump administration. And then quite quickly after that, picked up to be many more nationalities around the world coming across the southwest border. And the major change is that these were no longer primarily Mexican, no longer primarily single males trying to avoid arrest and apprehension by the Border Patrol, but instead were people that were looking for the Border Patrol, looking to be apprehended so that they could file a claim for protection in the United States, which then involves our asylum system. And those migrants tended to be heavily families with younger children, certainly some single adults, but the issue of families makes the whole question at the southwest border much more difficult. So with those changes, and with the policies that the Biden administration put into place in an effort to maintain some access to asylum and humanitarian protection in the United States, but at the same time generate enforcement, management, control at the southwest border, large numbers of people were permitted to come into the country in increasingly organized fashion through various measures that the Biden administration put into place. But the net effect of it was very large numbers of migrants from countries like Venezuela, Haiti, Ecuador, Colombia, and even further abroad that did not have significant ties in the United States, did not have significant ties to US communities. And because of policies heavily generated by Governor Abbott in Texas with the busing of migrants north, the concentration of these new flows fell on New York City, Chicago, Denver, to some extent, some other cities, but was heavily concentrated. Mm-hmm. And that changed the politics surrounding immigration and the welcome mat notion and practices that we have had up until that time, in a way that put the public into a very different place. And
let me ask you,
Trump was able to capitalize on that.
To capitalize, of course, of course. Let me ask you this just factually too, because it would be helpful, I think, to hear how you parse this. The Biden administration had a kind of theory of the case that it came to, let's say, relatively late in the term, which was, okay, one of the only ways we can manage what is right now a major upheaval in the Western Hemisphere, and beyond, frankly, in terms of mass migration, is to try to create legal avenues for people to come so that the border isn't always this pressure point that's unmanageable. And so the Biden administration, I thought fairly creatively, tried to open up different channels to allow for the orderly arrival, as you say, of people coming to the United States. So you have, on the one hand, a kind of concerted plan from the Biden administration to try to open up legal channels so that the border isn't just continually overrun. At the same time, it does seem like there were large numbers of people showing up at the southern border, overwhelming federal resources, and resulting in, large numbers of people entering, either with future court dates that were years off, or not even being fully processed just because the numbers were so large. Give us a sense, bearing in mind those two tracks of sort of what the Biden administration was trying to do and what was also just happening, circumstances on the ground, large numbers of people showing up. How many people were entering the country during the Biden years, and how significant were those flows historically? Like, if we were to pan out, were the numbers of new arrivals during the Biden years really historically significant?
They were historically significant. I don't know that we'll ever know the numbers entirely, because the ways in which we the data that are available to count them include overlaps of some of these categories. But according to our numbers, probably about 5.7 million people entered the United States during that period. That is a very large number. And they entered, as you've described, increasingly in ways that were channeling the flows, and in ways in which the executive branch was using to the very fullest extent, and far more fully than has ever been the case before, authorities that do exist in the immigration law. But they really were pushing the envelope in many ways, in many directions, without any help from Congress. I mean, it's
an important point. Yeah,
we can get to this, but the missing in action broadly in our system at this point is the Congress, because many of the things that need to be done to address these issues effectively require legislation. They certainly require appropriations, but much more fundamentally, they require substantive changes in our immigration laws. So the numbers became very high, and that was the case because of the change in the flows, the change in pressures that we've spoken about, but also because the Biden administration did try a whole set of new things. And some of the new ideas that they put into place have been real breakthroughs. And it would be fortunate or to our advantage as a country, I would argue, if we could try to play some of them out. That's, of course, not going to happen now. But the Biden administration's I think major failure was in never being able to explain it, and not creating a public story
narrative
about what was going on and what it is they were trying to do. Because what they were trying to do was to preserve access to humanitarian protection in the way that has historically defined us as a country, at the same time that we recognize, and they certainly did recognize, that we are a nation of laws, and border enforcement is an essential element of a functional, credible immigration system. That never came across in the public mind.
Yeah, it's striking to me too, because as you say, this stuff is complicated. This stuff requires political attention. It requires explanation. It requires some measure of transparency about what people are seeing and hearing. And, I just think, for instance, of some of these very innovative policies that the Biden administration came up with to open up legal channels for certain nationalities to come in a more orderly way. Part of what motivates that, aside from kind of world circumstances, the pandemic, political repression, economic collapse, and so on, is the fact that some of the countries involved, namely Venezuela, wouldn't accept deportation flights. And so, you have actual operational challenges where the administration is in a bind. If it wants to deport people in large numbers to show that there are consequences for those who arrive, it's quite a problem if the government in question, in Venezuela, for instance, or elsewhere, won't receive any deportation flights. And so, part of the thinking behind opening up these legal channels was also in response to that. But again, this requires a little bit of explanation and unpacking. And instead, the only narrative, it seems to me, that Americans were hearing, and certainly voters were hearing, was the Republicans hammering on this issue day in and day out, to the extent that I think people sort of signed on to the Republican and Trump agenda, maybe without necessarily knowing all of the particulars or what they may spell out, but just out of a sense that, okay, the other side is taking this issue seriously, whereas we're not hearing the Biden administration say enough. And so that gets us to this shock and awe that you described in the first month of the Trump presidency, the second term of the Trump presidency, which is, flood the zone with immigration actions, whether it's executive orders, whether it's, rules and regulations changes, whether it's enforcement operations, in part to just overwhelm any sort of political opposition, but also to demonstrate to the public, we're here, we're acting, this is definitive stuff, we're taking the actions you wanted the government to take. So let's go through some of these actions because they're dramatic, and I'd love to get your sense of kind of the historical significance of some of them. I mean, we can pick, there's a long list of radical actions recently taken. Let's start with birthright citizenship. On day one, the Trump administration, through an executive order, announces that it will put an end to a practice that has basically been enshrined in law for almost 2 centuries, that allows those born on U.S. soil to become U.S. citizens. That, right out of the gate, the Trump administration has targeted as something it wants to do away with. How significant did you find that move? And what are you expecting to happen next on that front?
Well, it's extremely significant. It is not surprising because this issue of birthright, again, with President Trump, goes back to the very beginning when he questioned the born in the United States legitimacy of President Obama. So the issue of birthright, and it has been part of his thinking for a very long time. On birthright citizenship, however, he makes the argument, and many others make the argument, that birthright citizenship serves as an incentive to illegal migration, that people come to the United States in order to have babies here. There is no evidence that supports that. People come to the United States for opportunity. They come to flee oppressive conditions. They come because they have family members here. They come because we have employers who employ them, etc. Birthright citizenship, totally apart from this issue that for which there is no evidence as an incentive to illegal migration, is an essential pillar of our immigration system intersecting with democracy. Because birthright citizenship, of course, is rooted in the 14th Amendment, which was an outgrowth of the Civil War and of the ending slavery. And it is in our interests as a nation to have birthright citizenship in a way that affects people who are foreign born for these reasons. The quick notion is, oh my, if you end birthright citizenship, then there will be less people here who are, claim who are unauthorized. But it's exactly the opposite. The value, just the practical value of birthright citizenship is that if you have people in the country who don't have a legal status, that of course and we have 11 million plus people in the country that don't have a legal status, but that is a one generational phenomenon. That is a one generational phenomenon of an underclass, because those people can't vote, they cannot participate, they have far less in the way of economic opportunities to become upwardly mobile. Those are all serious problems for us as a country, but they are not permanently the case as a structural underclass, if I can use that terminology, because if they have children in the United States, those children will be US citizens. They will then be members of the US society in the full sense of the word in which we understand it, from the standpoint of participation, voting, equal access in labor markets, and the ability to do well and contribute to the society. If they are not citizens at birth, the numbers increase significantly of people who do not have a legal status, and that then does become an underclass that is built into who we are, which is extremely dangerous for us as a democracy and as a society built on the civic values of membership and participation and upward mobility.
So what happens? So, this executive order comes out, it shocks everyone. Maybe not because no one saw it coming, Trump has talked about it, but it's shocking just because of how radical it is. But it's an executive order. Is this, this is now already getting fought in the courts. What happens now? What should we be looking out for?
This was the first case, I believe, to be litigated, at least in the immigration portfolio.
Right.
And it was the first case where a judge immediately delivered a decision within days that it was unconstitutional. And he used the terminology that it was blatantly unconstitutional. And he colored the language in his opinion with more so than any case he'd seen in his experience. That's now, of course, under an injunction, but that does not, but they now need to get to the merits of the case. Now, law professors have argued across the board. There's just an enormous agreement across the legal community that birthright citizenship can only be changed with a constitutional amendment, that it is rooted in the Constitution, and that a statutory change for Congress to decide it, and certainly not an executive branch executive order, that birthright citizenship would be protected from being changed by either executive order or by statute by Congress. But of course, but with most everything that we see the Trump administration doing, these early skirmishes are just that. They're early skirmishes, because their intent is to get cases before the Supreme Court. And of course, they own the court at this point, or they believe that they own the court at this point. And so this case will certainly go to the Supreme Court, and then we will see, because the only real precedent case here is one, Supreme Court precedent case is one that dates back to, I believe, 1898 or 99. And in that case, the parents of the child that was contesting in affirming his birthright citizenship, and the Supreme Court did affirm that this child had citizenship by birth in the United States, but the parents of that child were lawful permanent residents. So we don't really have a precedent case from the Supreme Court where the parents did not have legal status. We have enormous amounts of practice and enormous amounts of constitutional history that reinforces what the 14th Amendment says about the equal protection of the laws, but that is where the administration is going, and that remains to be seen. Birthright citizenship is in some possible danger.
Well, and this is, I mean, to a point you made in there, this is very much the MO of this administration, and this is not my interpretation. They're explicit about this. Is first, as you say, let's go through the courts because, fine, we may lose at some of the lower levels, but eventually we'll appear before the Supreme Court, and we've got as receptive Supreme Court as we've ever had. And so there's that. But then there's of course also the political fact of, forcing this conversation. And I do think that, the broader public, starts to get desensitized to some of the radicalism of this agenda when it just gets sort of bandied about like this, when it just almost seems like a routine matter of governance for, an administration to contest this bedrock principle on day one of an administration. Another thing that falls into that general category of something that I think the broader public is probably cognizant of to some degree, but the kind of radicalism of what they're seeing maybe isn't dawning on people to the degree that it should, is the role that the military has begun to play in the broader immigration agenda for the Trump administration. Tell us what you're seeing in that vein, because that's something that I know as a reporter I'm beginning to track myself.
Yes, it's a very important point, and it ties back to the question you asked about lessons learned from the first Trump years. During the first Trump years, the administration brought the Congress to we had a government shutdown over the issues of funding the wall, and ultimately Trump had to yield on that, and the government shutdown ended. But he yielded on it by moving Defense Department money within the administration, within the executive branch. And we're now seeing a much broader effort and connection with Department of Defense funding and with Department of Defense resources to move the mass deportations agenda. We have not really gotten to the mass deportations issue. So, because there are many aspects of that, of course, that are extremely important. They are the tip of the front of the line of the shock and awe. And so in terms of putting the mass deportations effort into place, this use of military assets is available. And certainly with the Secretary of Defense that Trump has appointed, there is concurrence and cooperation. That is new. The Defense Department has historically not cooperated with the rest of the executive branch agencies unless under direct orders by the president with immigration measures. And those direct orders from the president have been few and far between historically. So you now have a great deal of compliance by the Defense Department, and the use of military resources is certainly in moving some money, but also in shock and awe. It's in the optics of military resources, military additional forces at the border, active military, which has largely not been the case in the past. We've always had military at the border in one way or another, ups and downs, but it's almost entirely been National Guard and at the request of states and governors for help with the Border Patrol. And it's been very useful because for National Guard, it has provided training exercises. The National Guard has been able to do infrastructure work with and for the Border Patrol over many years. This goes back decades. But active military is a different thing, because active military does go to the issues of readiness, which is a hugely prized and protected authority and practice by the military. So you now have active military. They, of course, cannot enforce immigration law. They don't have the training. They don't have the legal authority to arrest people. But the optics are that, in fact, that is what they're doing. They are support to the Border Patrol. They are not actually intercepting migrants, but they are a visible presence. Perhaps the more important or the more telling example of this is the military planes, because military planes flying migrants back to their own countries or to third countries as part of mass deportations is new. And that also is a show of force. It's a show of might. And
because ordinarily it's immigration and customs enforcement chartered planes that are used for deportation.
Exactly. They use charter airlines. And this turns out to be far more expensive than ICE's charter airlines. These airplanes can take fewer people. They can take about 80 people back, when ICE charters flights, and through charter airlines, they usually have anywhere from 110 to 120, 25 people on a flight. The military flights are almost 3 times as expensive per person as the ICE charter flights. And they take twice as long, because Mexico will not allow military to fly across its territory. So the military flights that are going to, and certainly not to land in Mexico. So the military flights are going further south, but they have to take a far longer route. Well, all of that is almost unknown. And but the visuals of the military being on the case is what the administration is doing as a whole of government approach, let's say, to this priority issue of mass deportations. And they are succeeding in that shock and awe effort at creating enormous amounts of fear throughout the country, especially, in immigrant communities. And yet the actual numbers of people being returned, at least so far, is on a par with what was taking place during the Biden administration. The difference is that the Biden administration's returns were largely from the border. The Trump administration's returns are from the interior, and they are random. I mean, it's indiscriminate enforcement. They talk about, and the strategy has been, criminals and convicted criminals. When we look at the numbers, we see that 55% of the people being returned so far are other immigration violations. Only 45% are actually convicted criminals. But the impression that's being created is quite the opposite.
And this is something you've really educated me on over the years. For immigration enforcement, when you've got such a large undocumented community living in the United States, immigration enforcement agencies have to come up with priorities for how they think about that population, who they elevate to, explore and investigate for possible arrest and deportation. And one of the things we've seen Democratic administrations do from Obama on has been to try to refine some of the priorities for how immigration enforcement agencies operate, so that you are not targeting people who haven't committed crimes. And in fact, people who have longstanding ties to the community, whose only kind of legal infraction was to overstay a visa or to have initially crossed the border unlawfully years before, those sorts of people would be spared. All of these priorities now seem to be out the window. And so tell us what that means operationally and just on a human level for people living in the interior of the United States now, who technically, I suppose, are fair game in a way that they weren't during the Biden or Obama years.
So it's interesting, again, in terms of the various dimensions of this, because Tom Homan, for instance, as the border czar, which is also a new thing that the Trump administration has done to elevate the visibility as well as the cross-governmental coordination around these issues, he has a clear strategy, and he has stated his strategy, and it is to go after convicted criminals. But that strategy it runs headlong into the pressure for numbers. And the pressure for numbers is intense. We've already seen 2 senior ICE officials, career officials, having been fired because the president has said that they are not producing enough numbers. in order to really carry out a convicted criminal's strategy, you have to have exceptionally careful, close coordination with state and local governments. We can come back to that. And you have to be able to sometimes go into communities to locate people. And the difficulties of locating people require much more time and effort. And so, given the pressure of numbers, when you do that, you also create the incentives for officers to knock on all the other doors in that apartment building as well, which is then what is considered collateral arrests and generates these other immigration violators. That's, of course, what we see happening. And it's baked in to the nature of this kind of enforcement. The reason, of course, that Tom Homan and others who know how this work is done and who have done it and have the understanding of how to go about executing a strategy like this, the reason that they are pushing so hard on sanctuary jurisdictions, and sanctuary is no one single thing. States and localities that have sanctuary policies have various different types of them.
But generally, just as a term, we're using that to mean jurisdictions that have been reluctant to cooperate with federal immigration authorities.
Exactly, and put limits on the ways in which they will cooperate. Typically, the limits are that they will cooperate when there is a serious criminal violator, and ICE has demonstrated or has stated that they want the person, but they will not otherwise cooperate. But the reason that they're pushing so hard on that cooperation is because if they are allowed to work in jails and other arrest locations, they are able to bring about much greater levels of deportable individuals that if they need to go out into the field. And so the pressure that they are putting on these and they're almost entirely blue state jurisdictions, and they're often cities that are blue that are within states that are red, which creates a whole nother set of tensions. Is because they need to produce numbers, and what we need to see now, and what the real difficulty will be, is that they are constrained by their own resources, because arresting somebody is just the beginning of the process. They need then to hold them. They need then to, because so many people come from so many countries other than Mexico, which are the easier returns, but they then need to basically negotiate return. Countries need to accept their nationals back. And as you said, some will, some won't. So it becomes a very complicated, very resource intensive process that needs new appropriations. We'll see whether the discussions now in Congress over the reconciliation bill will produce sufficient resources. But ultimately, there is the potential for a real tipping point here if those levels of deportations increase much beyond what we're seeing now, because the issue of employers, labor markets, particular sectors of the labor market, construction, healthcare, agriculture, are heavily supported by workers, many of whom are undocumented and many of whom live in mixed households. I mean, what we have in this country is this long-standing population of people without a legal status, as I said, about 11 plus million. And some people in the household may be US citizens, some maybe have green cards, some may have a status like temporary protected status, and some may be unauthorized, and some may be subject to deportation because of a conviction. But they are a population, 60+% have been here for more than 20 years. So we really are talking about an initiative on the part of the Trump administration that has far greater tentacles in our social fabric, in our labor markets, and ultimately, let's get back to democracy, in the issues of being part of a society in large numbers, but without the protections that others who also are participating in the society have, and that we take for granted as a democratic nation.
Yeah. I mean, you and I could talk about this for many more hours. I don't want us to finish without talking about one thing that's been very much on my mind, and I know on yours and on others, and it's tied to democracy in that it concerns the rule of law, and that is Guantanamo, a kind of blight on America's general record of the rule of law. It's been described as a legal black hole, really, since the war on terror years during the Bush administration. As you and I speak, there have been more than 100 migrants who were apprehended on U.S. soil, who have been flown to Guantanamo, held, some of them in some of the same facilities where al-Qaeda suspects were held years ago, others on a different side of the island. Almost all of them completely incommunicado, cannot speak with lawyers. We don't have any sense of what's going on there. I want to get a sense from you of how significant you find this, because, you know, Guantanamo Bay has been used historically to house migrants who have been apprehended in international waters, who haven't yet reached U.S. soil. What we're seeing now is something categorically different. We're seeing people who are on U.S. soil being sent to Guantanamo Bay as a way, it seems, of obscuring what is happening to them. How are you seeing what's going on in Guantanamo? How significant is it, and what does it sort of say about the administration's broader agenda?
Well, I think you've pretty well stated what it says, in that it is new. But as with so many immigration topics, there are, you know, kind of subsets of that.
Right.
It's new, but at the same time, as you said, Guantanamo has been a place that has been used in the past as a safe haven in efforts from interdiction to then repatriate or send people to other countries where they would be safe, so that they did not need to be returned to Cuba or, in some cases, Haiti, in prior circumstances. This now is a different goal.
Yeah.
The goal here is certainly deterrence. It is certainly a part of the shock and awe to create real fear. And I'm not so sure that it is as much intended to deprive people of their rights, although bottom line, that is likely to be the outcome, because this is still U.S. Where they're going is, I mean, Guantanamo is a big place, actually, and there is the part of Guantanamo where terrorists are being kept. There is a whole other part of Guantanamo that is a Navy base, and it is the Navy base where migrants have been in the past and where they are now being taken. It is, first of all, much more expensive to take and keep people in Guantanamo because of the rebuilding, the conditions, the use of military personnel that need to go there and be there. It is not a place where people want to serve. And so just recruiting, as compared to using a military base in the United States. There are all kinds of military bases in the United States where one could, and where in the past, for instance, with the Afghan movement into the country 2-3 years ago, that used military bases in the United States, that the administration could use. But of course, as you've said, Gitmo has a whole reputation, and it will be difficult for people to get lawyers, even though if they have a lawyer, they have the right to have a lawyer. The difference between being in Gitgo and sending people to Panama, for instance, on military planes, which has also happened in the last couple of weeks, is that once people leave the United States, they lose their rights. In Gitmo, they still do have some rights for a rehearing. But we
Yeah.
don't even know right now whether the fact they are being described all as convicted criminals, but we don't know
Right.
if that's the case. So
Right.
it is a black hole, and it is very much part of the imagery and the criminalization of the entire migrant and anti-immigrant and
Yeah.
to the country
Right.
narrative
Right.
that the Trump and belief system that the
Right.
Trump administration is pursuing.
Let me, as a last question, ask you this, and please don't feel compelled to end on an optimistic note, but maybe there's a glimmer of optimism in here. Has there been any, are you detecting any sort of political opposition to what Trump has been doing? Does it seem like there's any meaningful pushback? Is there anywhere you're looking to see whether that pushback is starting to materialize? What's your sense of that?
Yes, I think there is pushback that is starting to materialize. The Democrats, we didn't really fully get to this, but Democrats have been caught off guard on this. They have been caught off guard since the large numbers came to large cities, and however, the beginnings of labor market disruptions will become meaningful. Certainly, as a humanitarian matter, the faith community, churches, you are seeing mainstream church leaders beginning to speak out. I think that we will, but it remains to be seen where employers, largely will come out on this. Will there be a tipping point that has to do with labor markets? I think too, though, that we are seeing an effort at. I've got to stop this. I lost my train.
Yeah, you're
What,
saying that
yeah, no, I'm trying to, there's one other sector that I'm trying to think about.
you did,
We did
labor
employers,
market.
we did faith organizations. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Another thing that is very much at the grassroots level has to do with what's known as know your rights. There has been an enormous amount of work done over the years by grassroots level immigrant support advocates, other organizations, at making sure that migrants know what their rights are. We did some research at MPI during the first Trump administration about deportations at that time, which were not nearly on steroids in the way that they are now. But what ICE agents told us is that the biggest thing that they were encountering was people who knew that they had rights. Yeah, and knew that they did not need to allow ICE agents to come into their apartments once they knocked on the door if they did not have a warrant. We are seeing the know your rights efforts at the grassroots level really mushroom. And so, again, the ability of ICE agents to actually pick up people randomly in communities and by going through apartment buildings may be stymied in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Well, that's a great note to end on. Doris, it's a pleasure always to speak with you about these issues. There's so much more to say, always, and we should do this again. But thanks for the conversation. It's been sobering, but deeply informative as always. Well, thank you. Thanks for great questions and moving the points along. It's been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it. Oh, of course, of course.